All right, let's look at speciation processes. There are two types of processes that will, or I should say probably three. The first one is allopatric speciation, otherwise known as other country. And this is probably the easiest one to understand because we're separated by geographical barriers. The gene flow is inhibited by the geographical barriers. The organisms are separated. And because they're separated, the differences in allele frequencies accumulate, thus allowing them to change enough to have that reproductive isolation. So we're seeing this in the northern spotted owl and Mexican spotted owl. These are subspecies, and they're already showing different phenotypic and genotypic differences. One is by habitat, food source, and so the more that they are geographically separated, or the greater difference you have in these allele frequencies. Sympatric speciation, on the other hand, is where you have these genetic differences and genetic barriers with a group of organisms that live in the same habitat. So the example are these cichllids, okay? And they have adapted to different food sources. They live in the same lake and in East Africa's Lake Victoria. And at one time there were as many as 600 species. And genetic data does indicate that these species originated within the last 100,000 years from a small number of colonizing species from other lakes and rivers. So if you start out with a few species and now you have a lot of species, well, why? So some of them adapted to different food sources, and so you get at different depths. And so that can lead to genetic differences. So if you have feeding patterns happening at different depths, then you're going to have isolation between those organisms, and genetic differences accumulate. You can also start seeing with different food sources, you also can start getting different banding patterns, and what you're going to see is sexual selection occur. So those are going to go with certain banding patterns, or those females are going to mate with males of like banding patterns like them, and so that's going to cause, that sexual selection is going to cause more reproductive isolation of various types of cichllids. So food sources, sexual selection can play a role, food sources can play a role, and this is part of sympatric speciation. So you're within the same habitat, but behaviors change, maybe food source changes, something changes that separates them into two or more groups that reproduce only within those groups, and over time changes will accumulate.
So remember, the key to speciation is some sort of reproduction barrier or reproductive isolation. And there are two forms of speciation in which this can occur. The first is allopatric speciation. This is where you have a physical geographical barrier that separates a population. Remember, it's going to take many, many, many years for these changes to accumulate. But the point is there's a physical geographical separation. The other type is sympatric speciation. This is where there is no geographical barrier in the population, but we're going to use sexual selection, reduction in gene flow, and polyploidy if you're a plant. So these three things can affect how those populations interact with each other. So remember, allopatric, physical separation. Sympatric, there is not a physical separation. However, you still have a reproductive barrier.
Another sympatric with plants is polyploidy. Polyploidy is going to occur when you have non-destruction during the meiosis, and so you get a gamete that may have more or fewer chromosomes. So just to review, basic aneuploidy, where you get different number of chromosomes, is due to non-destruction. Your chromosomes don't separate properly. So with plants, what we see is two forms. We can get multiple chromosome sets, and because each chromosome has a pair, you get a fertile offspring that's produced. So autopolyploidy, we're going to get offspring with two sets or multiple sets of each chromosome. So the original number of the parent was diploid. For some reason, issue with meiosis, those diploid cells then fertilize and you get a polyploid offspring. That polyploid offspring probably cannot mate with the parent, but it can self-pollinate or mate with other tetraploids. So therefore, they are reproductively isolated from the original plants in the population. Another type of polyploidy is allopleudy. So you have species 1 and species 2 with different numbers of chromosomes. You get a normal gamete from one, a polyploid gamete from the other. And the first mating you're going to get is you're going to get offspring, but it's not quite viable yet. It can self-pollinate, but probably can't yet sexually reproduce with another plant. Next generation, though, you're going to have a second mating where you have a normal gamete fuse with that polyploid gamete, and what we get is you get an even number of chromosomes, and then that particular offspring is going to be quite viable. However, it probably cannot mate with any of the parent plants because of the particular chromosome number. So this is going to allow for speciation in plants where you get different polyploids, different numbers of chromosomes. Keep in mind, a lot of crop plants are going to be polyploid plants because of the way agriculture has raised them. So just to recap, alloploidy offspring, they can mate with each other to produce fertile offspring. However, they can't interbreed with the parent species. So thus, you have reproductive isolation. This is sympatric speciation because they live in the same area. Lastly, with natural selection, we can have adaptive radiation. This is where if you have open niches, the organisms can occupy and over time thrive, and their offspring will then accumulate certain adaptations from those that have survived and reproduced from that one founder species. So examples, we see this a lot on islands. The Hawaiian honey creepers in Hawaii, you have a founder species, and from that founder species over time, we have all these other different honey creepers. This is also Darwin's finches. I talked about this with natural selection. Those finches that were able to survive and reproduce on certain food sources, certain beak types for those food sources were the ones who survived to reproduce, therefore producing the various beak types over time.